Hello, in this lecture we're going to continue on our discussion of Perfect Competition, Chapter 13. Remember, the objectives are to explain how perfect competition serves as a reference point, explain why producing at and output at which marginal cost equals price maximizes total profit for a perfect competitor, determine the output and profit of a perfect competitor graphically and numerically, and explain the adjustment process for short-run equilibrium to long-run equilibrium. So now we're going to talk about the shutdown point. At what point would it be beneficial for the firm to shut down? And we want to take a look at this, of course, graphically in this case. So what we're going to say is basically any time that we are producing where price is greater, where price equals the marginal cost, if it's greater than the average variable cost, then the firm would still be producing. So if we had any profits up here, if our price was up here, of course, we know that we would have a profit because at this point in time we would be producing where the marginal cost equals the price. If this price line, this line here, was up here, then we would have a profit. If we're anywhere below the average total cost, so remember this is basically representing the total cost, then we are acting out as a loss. We know that that loss would be this area up here. And so we would be losing money, but we wouldn't necessarily shut down at that point. What we would do is try to minimize the amount of losses. We would still be producing where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. We will always basically, you want to keep that in mind at all times. But note that if the price is actually lower than the average total cost, then we should basically leave the market. And you could think of this kind of intuitively. So you can think of the act of what is the average variable cost. Those are the costs that change with the level of output. So as we make more stuff, those things go up with the level of output. So if we're making donuts, then the dough in the donuts goes up at the same time. If we think about the average total cost, then that includes, of course, the variable cost, the dough and the whatnot in the donut, but it also includes the rent. And so if we are talking about the rent, we still have to pay that even if we go out of business. Even if we go out of business, the fixed costs we still have to pay, at least in the short run. Therefore, in the short run, we're going to still be in business and try to minimize our losses as long as we are producing, as long as our price is greater than basically our average total cost here, even though if it's less than So now we're going to talk about the shutdown point. We're going to talk about it graphically. So here's going to be our graph at this point. Our question is, at what point should we shut down? And we're basically talking about the short run in this case and not the long run. In the short run, at what point should we shut down? We've talked before about ideas and areas where we actually are operating at a loss. Is it beneficial sometimes to operate it at a loss and try to maximize our losses but not shut down? And in the short run, the answer is yes to that. There are times when we would be better off by minimizing our losses, but not quite shutting down. When would that happen? Well, let's think about our price line. Remember, what we've looked at before was we said, if the price line is up here, remember where we always are going to produce. We're going to produce where the marginal revenue equals the price, or the marginal cost. I'm sorry. The marginal revenue equals the price, and the demand also equals marginal cost. We're going to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. As long as that point is anywhere up above the average total cost line, so if it was up here, then we'd be making revenue. Any point below the average total cost line, then we are making a loss. So any time we are, this price line is anywhere below this area, we are making a loss. Now, we're going to still be in production. We're going to stay in business in the short run, according to this theory, as long as this line is somewhere between here and here. As long as we are above, we should say, the average variable cost. So if this line is anywhere, meets the marginal cost, if marginal revenue equals or meets the marginal cost anywhere between the average total cost and the average variable cost, then we would be best off profit-wise to stay in business and minimize losses in the short run. If, however, this price line goes anywhere below the average total cost, then that's our shutdown point in the short run. Then we're better off going out of business than we are staying in business at that point. You can think of that intuitively. If we were to make things, say we're making our donuts again, we make donuts, the variable costs are things that go up with the production of the donuts. So if we're thinking about the variable cost, then those are things that change with the change in production. On the other hand, if we think about our total costs, they include the variable cost, but they also include fixed costs. So the fixed costs are still going to have to be paid. We're still going to have to pay the fixed costs even if we go out of business. Fixed costs being like the rent. So theoretically, if we went out of business, we'd still have these obligations we would have to pay in the short run. Therefore, as long as we're clearing the cost of the of the variable costs, then it would be beneficial for us to stay in business. If, however, we're not clearing the variable costs, we're making revenue below the variable costs, then it would make sense to go out of business at that point, and even though we are still responsible for the fixed costs at that point. So the short run market supply and demand. So while the firm's demand curve is perfectly elastic, the industry demand curve is downward sloping. So we'll take a look at the industry demand curve. We'll kind of compare that to the firm demand curve. The market supply curve is the horizontal sum of all the firm's marginal supply curves. So we've kind of looked at that in the past. If we're talking about a big market, it's going to be difficult for us to obviously do that, to calculate exactly what all the firm's marginal cost curves are. But in theory, you can think of that. If we were able to basically put all the firm's marginal cost curves together, that would be the market supply curve. And then the market supply curve takes into account any changes in input prices that might occur. All right, so let's take a look at that graphically. We have our market over here. We've, of course, got our price on the Y, our quantity on the X-axis, and we have our normal looking supply and demand curve. So when we're looking at the market, we have our downward sloping market demand, our upward sloping market supply curves. And then if we go over here to the firm, then we can see that we have our marginal cost, and we know that the marginal cost is basically kind of like the supply curve for the firm. If we were then to graph out the price here, of course, that's going to be at the equilibrium for the market. And if we just follow that straight through to the firm, we see that the firm is a price taker. Therefore, the firms going in, they cannot change this. It's going to be a straight line because they are a price taker at this point. So here's where the firm is at. Where are they going to produce? Where marginal revenue, price or demand, equals marginal cost at this point. In this case, if we were to graph that out and take that down to the average total cost, we can see that in this case we have a profit for the firm in this case. So the long run competitive equilibrium. At the long run equilibrium, economic profit is zero. And why is that? Because the idea is if you take a look at the entire market, if it's perfectly competitive and you don't have any barriers to entry or anything like that, and people could enter and leave the market, then if firms are making an economic profit, then other firms have incentive to go into the market, and that will adjust prices. So, and that'll create competition. So that's going to be the idea, of course, in a perfectly competitive market would be that the long run equilibrium economic profits are zero. So if profit create incentives for new firms to enter, market supply is increased and the profit will fall until zero profits are made. So that's the idea. The existence of losses will cause firms to leave the industry, market supply will decrease, and the price will increase until losses are zero. So that would be the opposite, effect. If people are not making profits, if they're losing money, then of course firms will not make it. They'll have to leave the market in some cases at some point, which will adjust the price. So if we look at the long run competitive equilibrium graph here, we can see where we're going to produce, well, where marginal cost equals marginal revenue equals price and demand, and that of course happens to be at this point where the average total cost is at as well. So if we then take a look at the market response to an increase in demand graph. So here we got our market over here, we've got our firm over here, we're going to have the same setup, and then we're going to say, well, demand in this case is shifting out. What causes demand to shift out again? Well, that's going to be something other than price, remember, is changing, meaning something like maybe more people entered the market, or maybe people's salaries went up so they can buy more stuff or something, or higher demand came in for some other reason than that. Shift in the demand. What's that going to do to our firm? Well, we can see again our supply, our price here was following through, and that's our marginal revenue. And that has now shifted up to the new equilibrium point. So if we carry that forward to the firm, we are now going to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And now, of course, we have this short run profit. So we're at this new short run profit. And what's going to happen if we are at that short-run profit, we see that firms are making an economic profit. That will increase the supply, meaning the firms will produce more and more firms will want to produce. Other firms will probably want to see that market and say, hey, they're making money, and might enter the market. We can see that we have the supply too then shifting out. And what will that do? Well, that brings us back down to this equilibrium point here. And we could say that this basically the long run equilibrium price here. And that's going to bring us back down to where the firm basically makes marginal revenue equals the marginal cost or the price and has no profit once again. So we have the short-term profit. In the long run, we are back to the point at which there's basically no profit for the firm in a perfectly competitive market, no economic profit in this case. So application. So we can take a look at this in terms of Blockbuster. So we know that Blockbuster at one point was doing very well. They were growing a lot. They were probably the largest video store for rentals and had kind of their own niche there. And then of course some competition came in with Blockbuster and in the form of different types of video rental, such as streaming video rentals and stuff like that, as well as things like Redbox, where other types of rentals that would rent just new releases and things like that. So when Blockbuster was analyzing should they stay in business or not, the owners of Blockbuster's chain video rental store had to close 2,000 of its stores after experiencing years of losses. So at some point they finally closed the stores. Initially, Blockbuster saw the losses. It was suffering as a temporary because the price was greater than the average total cost. So remember, where we're going to shut down the stores? We're going to shut down the stores when the price is less than the average variable cost. In this case, the price was greater than the average variable cost, even though it was less than the average total cost. So they were operating at a loss. They were minimizing their losses, but they weren't shutting down at that point. So, but after years of losses, Blockbuster recognizes that prices had fallen below these long-run average costs. So what do they do in the long run? In the long run, remember that everything is variable in the long run. So even the rent is basically variable in the long run. So if we have a sustained point at which the demand is low, then in essence, the average variable cost is kind of the average total cost, because in the long run, everything is variable. So if we had sustained losses in this way and the demand wasn't going to go back up, they had to at some point say, okay, this is a shutdown point, and therefore that's a time at which a company that was very profitable at one point did have to make that decision to shut down those 2,000 stores.